Hi everyone, my name is Scott. Welcome back to the channel. 5 movies to talk about this week. Let's get started. I Am Big Bird is a documentary film about the life and times of Mr. Caroll Spinney, who, from the character's inception all the way to Spinney's death just a couple years ago, was the voice and puppet master behind the character Big Bird, a character on the TV show Sesame Street. I over-explain because I don't know who all in what country has seen Sesame Street, even though I think Big Bird is famous enough that everyone knows who he is. This movie was released prior to Spinney's death just a couple years ago, like I said. It's okay. This man had such a long, storied, historic career that you could go for hours telling stories about him. And the way this movie attacks Caroll Spinney's story is by telling a lot of smaller stories about him. And because these stories are so short and compressed, the movie tends to feel pretty monotonous, like it goes on for a very long time. And this is not helped by the movie's soundtrack, which is very one note. It has one tone throughout most of the film's running time. When it gets away from that, the film kind of peps up a little bit, but for the most part, it has this kind of repetitive nature to the soundtrack that makes the movie seem longer than it really is. I'm kind of a nerd, so I was pretty interested in the nuts and bolts behind operating Big Bird as a character. A lot went into it. And over time, he developed a method of being able to read scripts inside the costume, so on and so forth. And all that I found interesting, if there just wasn't enough of it. I also found the story of his understudy interesting. That guy's name is Matt Vogel, and he does Big Bird now. He has also done Kermit the Frog since like 2017, I believe. And he was Caroll Spinney's understudy for almost 2 decades. Imagine having a job and not being able to do it, while the guy who is a legend is still doing the job you're going to have. That story to me is incredible. I find that concept super interesting, and the movie doesn't linger on it for too long. It does mention it, that someone calls him the most patient man in the history of television or something to that effect. I find that fascinating and wish it were a larger part of this, because I feel like that guy not only has stories to tell about Caroll Spinney, but has an interesting worldview of being able to have a job that he can't fully embrace for the better part of 2 decades. And that's the kind of stuff I was interested in. The movie's okay. I think it's a little better now that Caroll Spinney's no longer with us. It's a testament to his dedication to his craft for so long. It's okay. I would say if you have no interest in puppeteering or voice acting or things like that, this probably isn't for you. All right, what is next? Oh yeah, The Last Stop is another documentary film, this one about the Elan School, which was a boarding school in the state of Maine whose focus was on troubled teens. And when I say troubled teens, I mean everyone from someone who's been in and out of juvie all the way to maybe someone who went to a conservative household who got caught flirting. A wide array of kids, and that's mostly because there was money to be made. This school operated for the better part of 3 decades, and what made it controversial was its use of yelling therapy. Yelling was used for anything from asking for a soda all the way up to resolving differences. One of the adults that went to the school says in this documentary that when he drove up and went to his dorm for the first time, all he heard was screaming. Partner this with a hierarchy system that was put in within the students. Some of them had jobs that were over other students. It incentivized tattletales. It was just a recipe for disaster, but operated for just so long. And the documentary sets out to tell this tale. It's a story that I had never heard of. I didn't know anything about this going in. This movie it's a lot, guys. It is a bit of misery porn. It goes about telling the story in a different way than something like I Am Big Bird, where it told a lot of little stories. This tells a few stories about the kids, now adults, that went to the school, including the filmmaker who was also a student at the school. It's hard to sit through because there seems to be no depths to the amount of misery these kids were put through. It's just a lot, and since this movie is close to 2 hours long, I feel like there's probably a solid 20 minutes you probably could have cut out of the film and had a more cohesive narrative. Interesting. I thought the film was interesting, but it's a lot. Okay, what's next? Oh, it's The Hunt. Guys, who thought this was a good idea? It's the story about a group of right-wing conservatives, stereotypical right-wing conservatives, who are being hunted for sport by a group of stereotypical left-wing liberals. It's like the Hunger Games or The Most Dangerous Game, but this time with a political spin. Almost from the starting frames of this film, I was asking myself, who greenlit this? Seriously, who thought this was a good idea? And a lot of people say, well, this is satire. They're satirizing both sides of the political spectrum. But the film doesn't have respect for either side of the political spectrum. They just become vessels for stereotypes and what the other side of the political spectrum thinks of their counterparts. And portraying that at its face value is not satire. You're just portraying a stereotype. You have to have something to say in addition to this. If you don't have anything to say, you have kind of the Josie and the Pussycat style of satire, where it's just reflecting the thing you're trying to make fun of but aren't actually making fun of. And this leads the characters on both sides of the political spectrum to become very cartoonish. It's like conservative and liberal Mad Libs. You have to have something to say, and if this movie has anything to say, it gets up right next to it almost accidentally. It doesn't do anything on purpose. It borders into brilliance at one or two times, but it seems completely accidental. They just forgot to write jokes too, just like you have to have jokes. Again, the thing in and of itself is not funny. You have to make it funny. But this movie was just baffling. I don't know who greenlit it. I don't know why it exists. Universal Pictures did a lot of legwork having to do with the controversy. This movie was pushed back a couple times because people were outraged. They should have just been outraged. It's not very good. Oh, what's next? Oh yeah, Bloodshot, which would have been a great movie if it were released in 2003. This movie seems like one of those movies that was released in the wake of the Matrix sequels. It's one of those, we're gonna cash in on the sci-fi trend of the day type of movies that you would have seen in 2003, but it came out 17 years too late. Vin Diesel plays a soldier who witnesses the death of his wife at the hands of a terrorist. He is also killed but brought back to life by a scientist who puts nanites in his blood, which allow him to heal himself relatively quickly. And then he goes out to kill the guy who killed his wife. Or at least that's what the movie makes you think. This movie actually does tinge on some pretty interesting sci-fi ideas. There are some cool concepts at work here. It just doesn't explore any of them. It's too busy with explosions and slow motion. There's a lot of slow motion in this movie. There's a lot of explosions too, but there's more slow motion. If you played those clips in real time, this movie would have been 20 minutes shorter, at least. Add to that some of the action sequences are just ugly. Like there's a sequence that takes place in a tunnel where I think it's powdered sugar is dumped everywhere and is in the air, and you think it might look cool, but then they light it all with red lights and it just looks ugly. And the sequences that aren't ugly are just ripped out of better movies. There's an elevator sequence which would have been cool if Captain America didn't do it earlier. And that sequence has some truly Scorpion King level CGI. It looks awful. I will give this movie credit for one thing. It sets up a cinematic universe in the best possible way. It wraps itself up in a nice tight bow before the protagonists drive off into the sunset and ask what's next. And that's the best possible way to set up a cinematic universe. If it never happens, I don't feel cheated. If it does happen, you've set it up. So kudos for that. This movie is really dull and uninteresting though. And finally, The Upside stars Kevin Hart and Bryan Cranston. Kevin Hart plays an ex-con who has a parole officer. He's out on parole and needs to get a job. And through a series of miscommunications, gets an interview to be an assistant to a man who had a recent accident and is now a quadriplegic. He's played by Bryan Cranston. And Bryan Cranston also doesn't want to live because his wife has died and he had a do not resuscitate order on his life. So he hires Kevin Hart's character because he knows he will be a bad caretaker in hopes that he might die. Pretty dark concept, but this movie's actually pretty charming. Kevin Hart's character wants the steady paycheck. Bryan Cranston's character loves being amused by this guy's incompetence. And they strike up a friendship, and like I said, it's a charming movie. I don't think it's charming because of anything the screenplay does. The screenplay is pretty standard fare as far as a buddy movie like this might happen. But what lifts this script into better territory is the performances of its lead actors. I find Bryan Cranston completely compelling on screen. I'll watch anything he does, and he seems to be having fun with the role here. He has a very dry wit, and it worked for this character in this film. And I liked Kevin Hart here. I'm not necessarily a Kevin Hart fan. I liked him in both Jumanji movies, and I liked him here. There are some truly funny sequences, even though, like I said, it seems derivative of things that you might have seen in a film like this before, a buddy comedy. But I think both actors work well together to pull this material off. The movie does stumble a little bit at the start of its third act. I feel like there were a lot of chess pieces that it needed to set up to kind of pull off the ending. It probably should have been done earlier in the running time, but it gets those pieces in place at the start of the third act. It seems a little clunky, but the finish is enjoyable. This is not a movie that knocked my socks off. I'm going to revisit a lot, but I did enjoy my time with it and found it charming and frequently very funny. And that's it for movies. I did start one new TV show this week. It's HBO Max's original documentary series, Generation Hustle. I'm 3 episodes in right now, and it is a series about scammers. The first episode is about a bunch of millennials who were scammed, and the next 2, and probably the next one after that, I've watched the trailer for that one, are about people who do the scamming themselves. These people want to be rich and will do it at almost any cost. I wasn't a huge fan of the first episode of this series. It seemed didn't jump off the page at me. But the second and third one I enjoyed quite a bit. The second episode is about WeWork, and the third episode is about a Detroit area rapper who doesn't so much make music as he makes instructions on how to pull off credit card scams. Seemingly, his songs are just a Bible of how to scam people. And I thought that episode was very well done and had a ton of twists, which I enjoyed. So I'm enjoying it so far. I'm probably gonna go import this footage into my editor and watch another episode of this show. So what have you guys been watching? Anything interesting? I'll see you down in comments, and I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.